Welcome. I'm Harmony Slater, your host of the Finding Harmony podcast. Over the past 20 years, I've taught thousands of yoga teachers and students to explore the intersection between ancient wisdom and modern everyday life, using mind-body practices to heal, awaken, and manifest their dreams from the inside out. This podcast is a sanctuary for those feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges. Are you ready to jump in and discover how these challenges aren't actually in the way, but are the way to finding harmony? Let's invite the magic back in. Today's conversation is a special full circle moment for me. Over a decade ago, Paul Bramadat stepped into his very first yoga class, and it was in my studio in Victoria, British Columbia. And now, years later, he returns here to have a conversation, not just as a student, or not only is he now a teacher of yoga, but he is the author of a book called Yogalands. This is a beautifully written, thought-provoking memoir that explores what it means to walk a spiritual path in an ever-changing modern world. And Paul is not only a seasoned practitioner, but he is also a professor of philosophy. We often connected with a lot of very deep and interesting conversations back in the day in Victoria when I had my studio on the topics of philosophy. He's a brilliant thinker, a gifted storyteller, and in this book, he's weaving together many of his insights, not only from his history as a professor and someone who studies philosophy and culture and anthropology and religious studies, but also his own personal transformation that he experienced and the research project that he did where he had conversations with literally hundreds of yoga teachers, often very famous and well-known ones, to discover what yoga meant to them, what brought them to the path, to get their ideas and impressions on important topics like cultural appropriation or the abuse of spiritual teachers within the yoga culture. And so we are diving into some really important themes here in this episode. We're not just sticking to your average downward dog and upward dog and asanas that was the sort of through line to his research, but what he discovered was even though our modern yoga culture is primarily focused on the practice of asana, what practitioners and teachers are deriving from the practice itself runs much deeper and is much more transformative. And so if you've ever felt a bit like a pilgrim on a path, wandering along this yoga world, trying to make sense of what's going on when it comes to life and healing and other interesting things, we are going to weave together what is often a messy and magical process of waking up today and look at it through this lens of yoga. So let's just welcome Paul Bramadat to the show and get started. Hi, we're so excited that you're joining us today for this beautiful conversation with someone who is a past student of mine.
Is that you're referring to me?
No.
You're talking about that time when you slept with your student.
No.
I came out to visit you and you were sleeping with me
No.
while I was practicing with you.
No.
No?
No.
Oh.
I'm talking about Paul Bramadat.
Oh, Paul, how are
should
you?
we call a therapist for this?
Are you a licensed therapist
I'm not.
as well?
I'm a doctor, but
You
not that kind of doctor.
Yeah.
We could use your help.
Yeah,
You're a doctor, you're a PhD, a scholar.
true.
of
Guilty.
Religious studies.
Guilty as charged.
And it's amazing. We received this book in the mail from Paul Bramadat. Am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah.
Sir? Bramadat. Yogalands, in search of practice on the mat and in the world. And I was tasked to take a good look at it, and I know Harmony really
I actually
enjoyed
read
reading
this
it.
one.
And director of the Center for Studies in Religions and Society at the University of Victoria, where you used to live.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, Harmony used to live out there. And then lo and behold, she's in the book. Her name is in the book. Maybe not as high up as her ex-husband, but
Hey, dude, it's alphabetical. It's not my fault. She's a Slater.
Oh, alphabetical.
It's alphabetical.
Yeah. Okay.
That was just, I was very careful to keep that one alphabetical.
Fair. Yeah, I see it.
No, but
So-
Harmony kind of haunts my memories of those early days in a Casper the Friendly Ghost kind of way.
Oh
definitely a
man,
friendly
she
way.
is a real bitch when you're studying with her. I have to agree with you there.
I'm really not.
She was demanding, but
Tough.
in the best way.
She is tough. Is it the best way?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
That's what we should talk about. Is it the best way? We can talk. We can get right into that.
Which is funny because I'm not really known for being tough. I think most people who come and
What?
practice with me think I'm very soft.
Oh, I don't think so, sweetie. I don't think that's what people think about your Mysore room.
I think they do. I think they think
No.
I'm like really soft and
No,
coddling.
No, I'm sorry. No. You don't think that, Paul?
No, I mean, I think there's a kind of a quiet strength there that I think your students all recognized. But you weren't going to put up with any nonsense.
No, doesn't put up.
No,
with
I'm a
any
no
nonsense.
nonsense kind of teacher.
Yeah, which I appreciate.
I am a kind of a seethe with anger and resentment kind of teacher.
Oh,
Kind of where I sit.
that's kind of like not a vibe people want to be around.
I know, and it's also like the vibe that I sit with, like in my daily life as well. And people don't seem to want to sit with me either.
Yeah, we just leave you to your little room.
Oh my gosh!
I'm a keep it light teacher because I'm now teaching, not just writing about yoga.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're teaching now too. You went and did a teacher training. Was that with Ariel?
That's right. Yeah, I did a teacher training. Initially, I did it for anthropological reasons because everyone kept talking about these mythical TTs. When I was out in the field,
Yes.
all through North America, people were saying the TTs are a really crucial experience, regardless of whether I was in an Ashtanga setting or a Iyengar setting or whatever. And so I thought anthropologically, that's what you do. You need to follow what your participants were doing. So I thought I would do that and wasn't intending really to teach. But it was so fun. I had so much pleasure doing it. And I thought, I think I'll give this teaching thing a try. Oh,
Can I just put a little red flag in one of the things that you just said? I think, is it true that normally that when you study something that you get that deeply involved in it? Like, isn't there supposed to be a kind of scientific distance?
yeah. So, I mean, it kind of depends on what side of the study of religion you come from. So a lot of my colleagues are text idea, philosophy, history people, and they don't want to talk to real people. They don't want to have kind of real experiences. They're very happy in their dens, which is fine. Like there's real value to mastering languages and texts and so forth. But I'm more of a contemporary religion in the real world kind of guy. And so, if people are eating a certain food, I want to eat that food. If they're going to go to a particular place, I want to go to that place. I want to experience things with them. So I'm trained as a sociologist, anthropologist of religion, really. So ethnography is really my principal tool. So I want to do everything people are doing.
And so an anthropologist, you would go and you would live in situ, and you would eat and live and breathe and learn the language. And that's quite a bit different from just leafing through an old dusty, musty text.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm not that interested in. I mean, I don't mind learning about what Patanjali and Tantra and all these things were about in the 3rd century or the 12th century or whatever. But I'm actually way more interested in how a person in Brandon, Manitoba or Detroit thinks of themselves as a tantric yoga practitioner. How does that make sense? And then understanding their story, understanding how those traditions and texts kind of mean something in their lives.
Well, my dad is from Detroit. I'll have to ask him.
He doesn't practice yoga though.
He's kind of weird in his own way.
This is really, I found that really interesting. An interesting kind of concept. I read. I did a first-year anthropology course as well as a degree in religious studies. Yes, and the ethnographic sort of content in this book is really, really fascinating. It makes it a really interesting read because it's not just your typical yoga book telling you about the philosophy or, the stories or debates, traditional yoga debates. It's really based on a lot of your personal experience and then research that I think was primarily question and answer, right? Like surveys that you gave people?
Well, actually, I did a survey of 650 people, like Canadians and Americans, and then I did visits to 7 different cities in North America, and I did long interactive interviews. So the interviews were usually like an hour and a half in most cases. And then I would practice with people, and I would be taught by the teachers or taught by the people we were interviewing. And then you would just kind of hang out in their studios and go for dinner with them, go for lunch with them, see what their worlds looked like. Sometimes I would meet in their home. Sometimes we'd meet in a cafe they liked. So yeah, I mean, in fact, I think
Nice.
the 2 most interesting kind of sources of data were the face-to-face interactions in people's special places, whether it's their home or studios, and then actually putting my body into their spaces. So I went to 65 different yoga classes, and of course I've been practicing, since 2013, as you know, and so that data from my own body and from my experiences with all these teachers and students, that's kind of the main thing that informs the book. And then there's a survey. The survey was helpful, but it was kind of to buttress the kind of ethnographic interview content. And then I did all the normal things like reading philosophy texts and other sociological texts. So that's the nice thing about religious studies and ethnography, is that you don't dismiss any form of data. You kind of just let your nose tell you where to go.
Can I start with that? Then
Yeah.
I'm interested in how your nose got pointed in the direction that it did.
Yeah.
Because it does, and I'm wondering, as the project arises, did it come to you as you started becoming interested in the lifestyle choice that you made, or did you pursue the lifestyle as already something that you were looking for to study?
Yeah, that's a great question. In some sense, it wasn't my nose that pointed me in the direction of Ashtanga. It was my knees, because my knees kind of just blew up. And when I was 45, and my knees just kind of, I had this arthritis attack essentially, and my doctor said, "You're pretty much done. No more of anything except knee replacements and serious pain medication." And I was really just looking for something that I might call Indic physiotherapy. And I sort of literally stumbled into Harmony's studio because a friend of mine whose name is Scott, who practiced with Harmony and Jeff, said, "Oh, you should try this yoga thing." And I said, "Oh man, like really? I don't want to do that thing. Come to the West Coast. I'm from the middle of the continent. I didn't want to come to the West Coast and fall into all these sort of stereotypical patterns." But I was in a crisis, so I found my way into the Ashtanga studio. And I was going to say miraculously, let's just say profoundly, it changed me. First, it just changed my knees. And I thought, okay, good, I'm done now. I sort of sorted out this pain and suffering problem. But then I sort of stuck around because you begin to sense that there's something richer and deeper at work here. And it was affecting other parts of my body, but also other parts of my mind. And then eventually, I thought, okay, what I don't want to do is turn my gaze onto this thing that I'm really enjoying. And the academic gaze has the tendency to wreck the thing you're gazing at.
Yeah.
It does. Just like a lot of people who love, they were 12-year-olds and they loved reading The Hobbit. And then they think, oh, I should be an English professor. And then they realize being an English professor might actually kill their love of reading. That's what I was worried about. So, but eventually...
Kind of like becoming a yoga teacher might kill your love of yoga.
Yeah, sure. Or becoming an anatomy, learning Sanskrit and becoming an anatomy expert might actually kill the sort of magic you experience. But it had the opposite effect on me, actually. It actually has kind of enriched my experience as both a scholar and a student of yoga.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's how I got to it.
And in the West, it's kind of required that you get a kayak and a big scarf and become a vegan. Did you do those things too?
I did. And I got a tattoo.
Oh, you got a tattoo.
Oh my God.
Oh yeah, we should get tattoos.
I know, it's terrible.
We keep
We've been
thinking about it.
Yeah.
I can't believe. Well, you're not even 50 yet. This was like midlife crisis tattoo.
That's what I keep saying, is that maybe it's like a 50-year-old type of situation.
Yeah. Yeah. So, only thing I haven't done is change my name. So I hardly eat any meat. I hardly drink anymore. I have a kayak, a tattoo. I just need to go, start calling myself Cedar or Sitka or something like that, and then I'll really be that guy.
Sequoia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or Shishya.
Sequoia is a good name.
Yeah. I can rock Sequoia.
Especially for British Columbia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sequoia Bramadat. Yeah.
So I'm curious, you did classes in Iyengar yoga, Ashtanga yoga, Vinyasa yoga.
Yeah, we did pretty much anything we could find. A lot of hot yoga.
Hot yoga. Okay.
We did some restorative. I went to Dharma Mitra's Shala in New York.
Nice.
Oh, awesome.
Did you get to hang out with Dharma Mitra?
No, he wasn't there that day, but his sort of next level down teacher was there.
Yeah.
I think we did some people who were trained in the Anusara tradition, but who are no longer officially there, of course, but they found their way into other forms of Hatha yoga.
Anusara inspired.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so and then we did a couple in sort of fitness spaces, so like Good Life Fitness, and because we were kind of curious to see like what would that feel like compared to doing it at a Iyengar or an Ashtanga Shala, which is much more.
What did it feel like?
Well, it's funny because that one at Good Life Fitness, I met the teacher and I said, here's what I'm doing. I brought my research assistant with me. And I said, this is the kind of book I'm writing and the research project. I'm curious about religion, spirituality, secularism in the yoga space. And he said, oh, this is just a fitness class. You'll find this is entirely not about any of those things. And I said, okay, well, I'm here. I paid my whatever I had paid to get into that class. That's fine. I don't mind fitness. Yeah. And sure enough, he turned the lights down. He used Sanskrit language. He had everyone sort of breathe quietly and calmly. And I thought, oh, this is fitness, eh? Okay, cool. And at the very end of class, at the end of this class, when we're in Shavasana, people roll out to the right, sit up, come into a comfortable seated position, and half the class says namaste.
Yeah.
And,
wow.
and he bowed back to them. And I thought, again, I'm not in the business of saying you have to call this spiritual or religious. That's not really, I don't really have a horse in that race. But what's fascinating to me as a religious studies guy is to think about the way in which we frame an activity as being secular, spiritual, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, Harmony, in the shalas that you've been attached to, there's all kinds of, there's Shiva, there's Ganesh, there's mala beads, there's incense, there's Sanskrit, there's the leaf from the tree that the Buddha was enlightened under. There's all these things in so many yoga studios, and people will stand right beside those things and say, this has nothing to do with religion. And you think, okay, the elephant-headed guy there, just, I don't want to burst your, but again, I'm not in the business of saying you must call this Hinduism or Buddhism or, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the way people actually combine various kinds of discourses, rhetorics, symbol systems, whatever, secular, fitness, spiritual, religious. And I'm just actually curious, endlessly curious about the way people feel very comfortable combining them. And that tells us something about the nature of religion and spirituality in the contemporary world, that there's no longer hardly any punishment you can fear for doing that, for combining a bit of a secular, fitness orientation with a bit of Buddhism, with a bit of Tantra, with a bit of, you can do all that stuff. I have a PhD student doing her PhD on Christian yoga. And again, people do it. They combine all these things.
Well, having suffered litigation for this very question, there are some consequences.
Not personally.
Well, it felt very personal, especially, and I would never recommend this to anyone, going on NPR and having to tell the listening audience, a national listening audience, that Hinduism was not a religion, but in fact, a tent pole of different, spiritual practices. And now we can talk about the definition of spiritual, but your time is running out, I'm afraid. And I'm having this conversation with the attorney who had sued my organization, it wasn't actually my organization, but it was the school district that my organization had attempted to infiltrate the national school system with these neo-fascist dogmatic techniques, as Dr. Candy Gunther Brown suggested. Did you ever have a chance to talk with her? She was their kind of lead expert on the side of the family that sued our school district.
Yeah, I've met Candy, and also Andrea Jane, who's on the front of the book, was also involved in the broader conversation around the case, and henceforth. So I'm familiar with the folks involved and the arguments being made, and it's often the case that these arguments, there's a kind of lost opportunity for all of us to broaden our definitions. Like in your case, to say, well, you could think of Hinduism as a religion, but you can also think of it as this broad, as you say, this kind of big tent, with all kinds of figures and forces underneath that tent. And, to sort of test the question of the separation of church and state in the school context, like in Encinitas, I think it was a useful test in some ways, because it got people to have the conversation. But was the public discourse made any more sophisticated by the outcome of that conversation? I don't know.
Yeah. It was super interesting. I mean, it was an incredible time for me to be involved in it. It felt very important. And when Judge Meyer, released his ruling, which is mentioned in your book, yoga may be religious-y, but given that the school district is in charge of the curriculum and all of the trappings of religion have been removed from the curriculum, then therefore it's allowed, and he allowed it to remain in the system. But so much had to be taken out, like the Sanskrit, like the images of deities and gods, like Patanjali's Yoga Sutras couldn't be mentioned.
It's religious-y in the same way that like Fantasia is religious-y.
Okay, yeah, I can see that
crisscross applesauce thing.
Big red god there, yeah. What was fascinating to me, though, was that our motivations between Candy and I, or the attorney in the school district, our motivations were so fascinating to me, because we were there for children's health, though it was projected onto us that our motivations were to turn these children into religious fanatics. Yeah. It was farthest thing that we wanted to do. And then on what we suspected of their side, and this is a Catholic family that sued us, we thought because they themselves were not allowed to bring religion into the school district, and if they could win the lawsuit, then, or actually if they could losing the lawsuit meant that they could then bring some kind of Catholic practice or neo-Christian practice into the schoolroom. So there was a kind of like Taoist circle going on of motivations that were very peculiar, and suddenly we were on this forefront, the front lines of a culture clash that is now, as you can see, spilled out into every part of the fabric of American life, where anything, whether it's a hot dog, a cup of coffee, or a baseball game, is now being defined as either right or left. Yeah. And this became like, it's suddenly like this yoga to kids. What could be wrong with that? Yeah. This is the fight they wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. They were worried about it being kind of a Trojan horse for other forces that you had packed into that horse. And that eventually, once those kids were kind of lulled into a kind of a warm feeling about yoga, you would say, well, you know what, let me get you to sign here where you're going to become a Hindu. Again, in some sense, fair enough for them to raise the question about, hey, this is a practice we don't know anything about. Our kids are, they have questions about it. We as parents have questions about it. We were never educated about it when we were young. Could you help us come to understand what this practice is about and what your intentions are? And the problem is, when you look very carefully at these practices, you do see religion-ish or religion-y features of it, right? And so then, the response that you guys had, or that the judge required, which was to call things crisscross applesauce and to take out all of the kind of the Sanskrit philosophy and so forth, I think makes a certain sense within a particular kind of secularist orientation. I do think, and this is really a personal rather than a professional opinion, I do think it kind of robs the practice a little bit of some of its potential. So, for example, people sometimes teach mindfulness practices to the military or in schools or whatever, which I think they're fine. They have a very strong evidence base for working quite well. But of course, we all know that's derived from a particular Buddhist perspective. And if you actually want the full benefit of Buddhism, you also have to teach not just these practices for how to quiet the mind, but the purpose of quieting the mind is to see the world as kind of a complete construct and to see your identity as a construct. And to me, it feels like, well, you're getting some bits of what the Buddha wanted you to get, but you're not really getting the point.
Yeah.
So, the point. I don't want to say there's one point, because I think even just stilling your mind is its own value, and teaching kids to be calm in their bodies and flexible and strong and to breathe well in an asana class. I think that's its own benefit. It would be nice to build in little windows, though, for other questions they might pose as kids.
Yeah.
There's another aspect to this that was quite challenging for me personally, was about motivation, was Candy's thesis, or Dr. Brown's thesis. Forgive me, Candy, if you're out there, for undermining your credibility. Dr. Brown's thesis that what was going on is that there is a secret a conspiracy among white women to undermine religion in the United States and in North America, that there is 40 to 50 million women who are trying to undermine religion and replace it with this cult that was destabilizing to the fabric of North American life. And I, in the quiet of the dark, I wasn't sure that it wasn't completely true. I was like, yeah, I think that is what we're doing.
The witches are back, baby.
And I told that to a public relations guy, and he said, don't say that on NPR. Don't you dare. Yeah, that really happened.
Well, but isn't that true, though, that to ask the question, hey, Candy, or hey, other lawyers, why do you think so many people, let's say white women in their 30s and 40s and 50s, love this practice so much? What is it doing for them that going to church or, whatever else they might do, what do you think it's doing for them that those things aren't doing for them? And it would maybe be useful to think, why has this practice that for 2 millennia or so was for men, by men, about men, totally imagined the male body, has now become about 80% for women, about women, with the woman's body imagined as the sort of default body? It's worthwhile to actually have that conversation. And you can't have that conversation if you see harmony as like some kind of threat to American culture.
Yeah,
right?
The
Like
devil.
if that's how you're framing,
I'm a big threat.
yeah,
She's a witch. She is. That's a common. That is a typical trope throughout American history.
Yeah.
Is the witch undermining the stability of a patriarchal society?
Yeah.
And I imagine it is terrifying.
Yeah, and it's better to ask questions about like what's wrong with patriarchy, right? And then you can say, wait a second, seems to be that there are some people who are not comfortable with this patriarchy thing. Maybe we should talk about that. Rather than how they, the pointy hats and the fact that they meet elsewhere. Like, it just seems like the focus is on the wrong thing.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Like that, it's really like these questions are only brought up by Margaret Atwood in Canada. Like they don't get asked down in the
and
States.
Paul Bramadat in his book Yoga Land.
Yes, exactly.
I really did enjoy, especially the beginning part where we're talking about, where you write about what is religion-ish and yoga being religion-ish and the difference between religion and spirituality. And it even got me using ChatGPT to define things for me, just to like kind of see what, the master brain thinks about things. And also the connection between politics and yoga I found very fascinating too. And I think that's kind of what you're speaking to, and also what you're speaking to with this idea of patriarchy and the rise of yoga being infused in North American culture. I guess sort of elevation of women and women's empowerment through this practice of yoga in particular, it becoming something that, women are kind of known for even more so than men, whereas, as you say before, it was primarily a male practice for
thousands of years.
Yeah. And also the difference, and I'd love for you to talk about this a little bit, between like the political kind of connection of yoga in the States versus Canada, and like some of these differences between the United States and Canada I found very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, originally when I started my project, the way I got the grant was because I was arguing that I was very curious about the very big differences we're seeing between Canadian and American societies. And I thought, well, what if you went to the same thing, like a yoga studio in Canada and a yoga studio in the States? Would you see those political differences reflected there? And short answer, I didn't see very many differences reflected there, except around definitions of health, right? So I think in an American context, where even if you have very good healthcare, there can be these mystery charges, or you can spend a whole year on the phone with bean counters and lawyers to make sure you get adequate coverage. And medical bankruptcy is a real thing. So I'm sure your listeners are familiar with that story. But in Canada, it's a very different scenario. We kind of think the state kind of has our back. It might not be very efficient, and the hospital might not be very beautiful, but the idea of a medical bankruptcy for the cost of the procedure itself isn't really a Canadian thing. There are other things to complain about, but they're not so much that. So as a result, in the States, I found that the practitioners and the teachers I was talking to, they tended to frame yoga as a kind of a health intervention to prevent them from being in the hospital. Whereas in Canada, it was sort of a like a wellness enhancement, right? So this is a part of my wellness life, my health journey, but I'm not relying on it to keep me out of the hospital, because going to the hospital is a pain, but it's not going to bankrupt you here. But
I can't stress enough how different your worldview is as an American when you grow up in poverty, as I did. When you absolutely know that if you get sick, one will bankrupt you, but there's no way you're going to go to a doctor in the first place unless it's an emergency, which is so much more tremendously expensive to manage an emergency, rather than substantive care, over the length of your life. And I had the opportunity to teach yoga in Taiwan for 3 years, and it was even tremendously so much more in that direction in Taiwan, where it was just standard and everyone encouraged me, everyone was doing it, and it was paid for by the government of Taiwan, that we all go to the acupuncturist once a week to manage inflammation in the body. And they know after thousands of years that that you have to manage inflammation in the body to be healthy, which wasn't something as an American, like that's my ass if I'm inflamed. Like this, the government doesn't give a shit at all,
So I mean, in that chapter in the book that's on politics, I talk about the kind of capital P politics, the way maybe Narendra Modi might think about using yoga as part of his branding for India. But even what Ross was just talking about, that kind of legal case that's very famous now in religious studies circles in Encinitas. But actually, I think what I'm a bit more interested in is actually the more subtle ways in which the popularity of yoga is a kind of a critique of the dominant culture. Because I part of what I trace in the book is that by going into all these yoga spaces in North America, you find in one way that you're in the same world, that yoga spaces, whether you're in an Ashtanga space or a kind of a generic Hatha space or a restorative hot yoga space, there's kind of an effort to make these spaces sort of similar, which is why I call it yoga lands. So you're in a different country almost. And the spaces are kind of an antidote to a world that's too loud, too fast, and too dirty, is the kind of claim I make. And yoga spaces are slower, quieter, and clean. And they give you kind of a feeling of escape from that world that's quite harsh, neoliberal, competitive, toxic, on fire, etc. And I think, Harmony, like what you were referring to before, is that there is a debate about politics, partly because there are some critics of yoga who say, hey, look, all these white women are escaping they're using yoga space as a way to escape from political entanglements or from their responsibility to fix the world.
Right.
And so they escape to these places where their beauty and their youth and their whiteness are kind of protected and celebrated. And so I sort of draw attention to that kind of debate in the public arena.
Yeah.
And say, hey, look, the debate is legitimate. We have to think about, eating disorders and views of women and women's bodies that are totally out of sync with reality. But we also have to think about how everybody needs a sense of safety and security, and if yoga spaces are providing them in a world that's literally and figuratively on fire, then maybe we should just let that happen and see that as in itself kind of a small political gesture, right? It's to give people a place of calmness, of strength, of safety, and of serenity, even just for an hour a week, or in our case, for 6 hours a week, or 12 hours a week, or whatever it is. That's not nothing, right? I mean, it seems to me that healing experience and that sense of calm that a shala can provide is itself a kind of a small p political gesture.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, like that whole conversation I find kind of fascinating, because I do feel like on a large scale, it is doing that, creating a sanctuary that provides, humans with a refuge, to take refuge in this sort of peaceful environment where they can actually tune in to their inner self in a quiet, silent, embodied practice place. I have a couple of things that come up to me when I think about this. First is I feel like there's a bit of a kind of privilege bias that's happening, in that there's people who really actually need this that aren't included or don't feel welcome or aren't being platformed in a way that makes them feel like this is accessible for them. I think that especially happens in the Ashtanga yoga world, which I have a big beef about because it's so able-bodied centric. It's so, skinniness centric. It's
only really possible if you have a lot of money.
Yeah, and exactly to be able to take 6 or 12 hours out of your week to focus on,
or 6 months out of your life.
Go to Mysore, India, and spend that time. It's a very small number population percentage that can do that, and it really is a huge privilege. And so it's interesting because I think within that larger scale kind of debate around the political aspects of it, there's actually sort of a little bit of a war within yoga lands about this very thing.
Yeah, and some studios, as you know, they'll have some classes that are lower or just pay what you can. There's one quite radical organization in Indianapolis that we studied, where it's free, or you just pay whatever is appropriate, and they practice in parks and people's homes. And so it's funny. I mean, you're partially to blame for my slight addiction to this thing, so I feel like we're in a safe space here. So when my students, because I actually teach a course at university which is on the people, perspectives, and politics of yoga. So I teach yoga in the shala, but I also teach a course about yoga at the university. And when I teach the course about yoga at the university, I send them out into the Victoria yoga scene, and I say, take a class here, take a class there, write a paper that compares your experiences, that kind of does a bit of a deep reading of the physical space and who else you saw there. And students often make the comment you just made, which is that this is a privileged space. It's very expensive to use this space and so forth. Of course, they're doing a drop-in class, right? So they're paying $25 for their class. They're not paying a membership, which of course, I think I pay something like $4 a class, given how much I use the space. But when they come to me and they say, in the broader classroom conversation, they say this is an elite, very expensive practice. And I say, well, okay, out of curiosity, what did you guys do on the weekend? And I said, what did you do on Friday? Oh, we went for, a couple beers and a movie. I said, well, what did that cost? And a pizza, a movie, a beer. And I said, well, and how many of you see therapists? And half of them, I don't ask them to put up their hands, but I say, just calculate that. That's $150 or 20, 150.
At least therapists here right now, I think, are around 200 or more.
So I say, okay, and how many of you see a chiropractor? So, and I say, well, okay, look, all those things you just do in every month, which maybe costs you $300-400, I get all that kind of wrapped up for about 100 and I can't remember what my monthly fee is, maybe 150 or something.
Yeah.
So, I say it kind of depends on what you're valuing, where you're going to put your resources, as scarce as they may be. But what you and Russ just said about how it does tend to privilege able-bodied people, and it does tend to unintentionally, I think, reward people who are physically appealing, who fit a particular conventional model of what a beautiful woman or man looks like. It does, and I think the teachers I love are the teachers who, and I watch them very carefully, unfortunately, is that I watch very carefully when a student comes into the class and they don't have that body, or they don't have the fancy yoga clothes, and they clearly don't kind of know how to stand, where to be. And which describes me when I first went into your shala. I was that guy. And what I watch very closely to see how a teacher will treat both like that person and somebody like you. And the teachers I love are teachers who treat them exactly the same. Yeah. And I think you're right, though, to say that this is a debate within yoga lands about how the broader yoga spaces can become more inclusive and also more respectful of the Indic origins of the practice as a whole, which I think is also quite important.
That's always a mistake that teachers make, and it was one of the first lessons that I received as a yoga teacher is to just be extremely aware when someone walks into the room that glows to you personally, and because you get so attracted to athleticism and ableness and talent that you lose the rest of the room. Yeah. And so it's a really important lesson and needs to be said to every teacher every day, because you always forget. The backbender walks in and it's like your heart explodes. It's like, oh, it's so nice. I wanted to just piggyback on something else that you had mentioned in a kind of cross comparative way, and my mind blew when you mentioned it and framed it around yoga. The notion that you were taking I'm paraphrasing, a privileged space, you're getting away from filth and getting into a place where your white youth and beauty can be preserved. I think that's just such a fantastic statement, and not something I've heard about yoga before, but it's so dead obvious. But it's exactly the narrative around early American painting, specifically the Hudson River Valley School, the paintings of Thomas Cole and Frederick Church and Abbott Thayer, very specifically in this case. Those painters in the late 19th century were intentionally and self-consciously escaping the filth of the Southern immigration wave that was invading the pristine American nature and going into the cities and creating ghettos and creating filth. And so they were going out to the Hudson River Valley, not because it was beautiful, but because it wasn't spoiled by these Southern European dirty, dark immigrants. That was very intentional, and the racism of it would not have occurred to them as being a negative. Yeah, it's like, well, yeah, that of course, that's our country. We're white. That's what we do. We need a safe space for our white women. And in fact, Abbott Thayer's whole career was celebrating white women as beautiful, clean angels. And he was a part of that Hudson River Valley School. And that's all his paintings are, is taking white women and portraying them as angels. The snow whitier, the better, And so thinking about that as a kind of through line through North American culture, that maybe there are other instances of this, like that, we're not talking about, but like that escaping this trope of escaping filth and finding a way to preserve your beauty in a kind of fountain of youth, is been a kind of myth that's been perpetuated about in the American ideal and dream the whole time.
Yeah. I mean, thanks, Russ. Yeah, I mean, I think that we could also see the same thing in a Catholic church or in a Pentecostal church. And I think if you did a study of Catholic churches, you would find there's a kind of common aesthetic there too, common way things smell and look, and the way things are laid out. And people kind of walking into that space just kind of instinctively know this is how I should stand, and this is how I should dress, and these are the appropriate kinds of people in this space or that space. And it seems to me that, the more diverse we can make our spaces, the more welcoming we can make our spaces, whether that space is called university, church, yoga studio, whatever, the more diverse and welcoming we can make these spaces, the better. And the more we can render visible that which is invisible, which in some cases is the Indic backstory of yoga, the more we can make those things which are otherwise kept invisible, the more we can make those visible, the better. Because otherwise, you don't want these spaces to be totally detached from reality. And one of the things that was always very curious to me during the field work we did for this book was, you'd go into a studio and then you would just sort of, before you went into the studio, you just like look around. Are you in Brooklyn? Are you in Winnipeg? What kind of a space is this physical studio located in? And what is the relationship between what happens in that studio and what happens one block away? And are the people in the studio aware that this studio is in a particular neighborhood with maybe a different demographic? Is there any effort to kind of remember the more diverse realities of that space? And the answers to those kinds of questions, which I did pose to the teachers and studio owners, was that some of them did have a real awareness of the difference between the sort of calm, quiet, clean space they offered people and the chaotic, frenetic, neoliberal, toxic, on-fire space outside. And others didn't. Others didn't really even want to talk about that. So
it's interesting. I mean, I think in Victoria, and also even in the space that Jeff is in here in Calgary, they're both they were both downtown spaces, and I think still are. And I mean, there was always, maybe not always, but often, frequently, there's homeless people, crack addicts, heroin addicts, like strewing out in front of the door.
Yeah, that's still the case.
And and so you're kind of confronted with the harsh reality of life when it kind of is in a downward spiral going downhill. The suffering, you're immediately confronted with the suffering of humanity in a very real, visceral way, either on your way into or on your way out of this little sanctuary of peace. And so it's kind of a fascinating juxtaposition that's happening there.
And not different from our experience in India.
Yeah, very similar to India, actually.
You have this kind of same model where you're seeking purification and a refuge from filth, and you even some aspects of your demographics of your society are branded as dirtier than others, and that you shouldn't even stand in their shadow. If you want to maintain your cleanliness, rather, your purity. And then you go to a place that is free from traffic, toxic air, and noise to do your practice, as it says in the
Hatha Pradipika.
And there's a kind of a interesting cultural assimilation there, that like you could almost say that white Americans saw that in India and said, oh yeah, that's us, we like that. Just in the same way that the Japanese may have looked at Buddhism and said, oh yeah, that matches us, we like that, we'll take that. That'll work for us.
I mean, I suppose that's this kind of tension between the chaos of your everyday dharmic, your duties, and the need to kind of retreat from that with a meditation practice, with a yoga practice, with a pranayama practice, whatever the practice might be that allows you to rescue yourself a little bit for an hour a day or an hour a week. So, the metaphor of yoga lands really extends, the land, as it were, extends from the sort of special places in India, whether it's Mysore, Goa, Rishikesh, wherever, to a studio, whether that studio is in Detroit or Winnipeg or New York, to the mat in your rec room, which becomes a kind of a set aside space, right? And that people might, for their daily practice, they might light some incense, they might shut the door, make sure the kids and the dog don't get in, but they're setting it apart from the chaos and the sort of dharmic weight or the load of their day-to-day life, which I think is a kind of a tension that is not unique to yoga. I think, again, Christians have prayer practice, or they have going to church, or they have Bible studies. So we all have our own ways of living in the kind of sort of dharmic realities of being a householder and being a parent or being an accountant or whatever our jobs are, and then seeking some kind of solace or some kind of safety and remove from those experiences, because those experiences are otherwise extremely taxing and they will draw every bit of life energy out of you if you're not careful.
I'm curious again, like I love this conversation, but I feel like there's another war in yoga lands that I want to talk about.
Let's talk about it.
So you said that connecting it to the sort of Indian heritage and having that through line is very important, which I also agree with. I think that it's really important to have the roots and understand where things come from and understand and honor the culture in which, that arose.
Right.
Yeah. But then there's this whole other debate, and you do touch upon it also in your book, about the cultural appropriation. Yeah. And it's kind of a funny balance. And it feels very much like what we're talking about as far as, this privilege and, the whiteness of the yoga practice in the West in some way automatically kind of assumes cultural appropriation.
How do you mean?
Well, just that, just if you're a white woman teaching yoga, there's an entire group of humans in another country, like millions, potentially billions of them, that are saying you're taking our tradition and it doesn't belong to you and you have no right in teaching it.
Yeah, we can assume that.
How did you bring these 2 points of view and find some harmony within them?
Oh, nice branding opportunity.
Thank you.
You're like an expert.
It's an easy one.
Yeah, it's an easy one. That was low-hanging fruit for sure.
Yeah.
So, when I went into the field and I started talking to people and hanging out in their shalas and homes and all that, to be honest, I went in there looking for and ready for big arguments about, or big conversations about, cultural appropriation. And I would find various ways to bring it up and various things to observe that would kind of create opportunities to learn about these things. What surprised me was that it just wasn't a very sticky topic. People kind of went, yeah, no, I get that. And I would bring it up again, like a good ethnographer, you're sort of hunting for something. People don't seem that interested. You come at it from a different angle. You think, oh, but maybe you didn't hear me, and it wasn't as powerful an issue. And, I think a person who gets very, very fascinated by Christianity, they're not going to feel like there's some deep need for them to learn Greek, Latin, or Hebrew, because Christianity has in some sense become fully indigenized. It's become part and parcel of Western European and North American life. And so people don't feel guilty about not knowing Greek, Latin, Hebrew, etc. And in the yoga context, because yoga's only kind of been here, really since the late 19th century, when Vivekananda kind of brought it, which is a bit of a misrepresentation because what he brought wasn't really Hatha yoga. It was the other types of yoga. But let's even just say for 40 years it's been here thriving, sort of a rich asana practice. And so it's only like a generation or a generation and a half that the asana tradition has really kind of had some weight in North America. And that's not very much time. So it looks a bit awkward for, as you said, for lots of white women to be maybe mispronouncing Sanskrit, or to never have gone to India, maybe never intending to go to India, and maybe feeling like going to India isn't really required for them to take ownership of the role of teacher. Or maybe they feel that there are gestures they can do at the beginning of a class that somehow nod in the direction of India or of the Indic origins of yoga. So, as you know, I'm half Indian. My father's Indo-Trinidadian. I was raised in this mixed race reality, and so I'm very comfortable with ambiguity, and I'm very comfortable with the idea that we are always borrowing and digesting and metabolizing influences, ideas, musics, clothing, food from other cultures. The question is, what is the attitude we bring to that, and are we curious about the things that we're digesting or metabolizing? And personally, I'm a fan of encouraging people to be as curious as possible. That, in some sense, is the purpose of the book, is to say, hey, there's all this other stuff happening in that yoga practice and in that yoga studio and in the kind of subculture we've built around yoga practice.
Yeah.
Can we get curious about it? And one of the things I'm curious about is this appropriation question, because, of course, the ambiguity here is that the early practitioners and teachers of yoga, including Krishnamacharya and others, wanted yoga to be essentially given away. They wanted it to be done respectfully, but Vivekananda came here. Yogananda, Vivekananda, Krishnamacharya, Pattabhi Jois, they wanted others to be practicing these practices.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted us to remember, I think, where it came from. This was, in some sense, their branding effort, to make sure that the West knew that India was the source of this profound, they thought of it as a philosophical tradition, firstly. So it had that quality to it. So I'm a fan of reminding people of its origins, but also just reminding people that actually some of the original gurus who came really were giving it away. It wasn't being stolen from them. They were giving it away. And which isn't to say that we don't have, therefore, or thereafter, a responsibility to honor it, to try to pronounce things correctly, to, if you're in a lineage tradition, to try to pay attention to what that means, positively and negatively. But yeah, I don't think, I'm sort of not any longer feeling that the debate is, are we or are we not culturally appropriating yoga? My feeling is more like, well, in some sense, of course we are. Can we do it differently? Can we do it as much as possible in a curious, compassionate, respectful way? And so that's why I think built into a TT, there ought to be some kind of lesson around this, and that the sort of origins ought to be kind of sort of front and center.
And I agree that our podcast should be part and parcel of every TT that's going.
We have amazing educational content on here.
Go ahead.
I have another question, because
I have a different through line. Okay. But do you want to stay?
No, I have a different through line too.
Oh, can I?
Yeah,
try
fine.
I have a story for you, and this isn't about necessarily appropriation, but it's about identity. Maybe we can cut this out if this doesn't work. But when I was 20, my first Ashtanga girlfriend, my first yoga girlfriend, we got together. She was her dad was from Trinidad, and her mom was a nice Jewish lady from Long Island, and we were very serious. We were living together. We were talking about getting married, and my mother had fantastic, violent fights with my grandfather because Tamara, my girlfriend, was black. By no stretch of the imagination in North American life, she would be, like, oh yeah, she's a black girl. And it was interesting because she started really getting into her ethnographic history. She was getting a PhD in musicology and exploring through lines of culture, especially in North Africa, that she was fascinated with. And then she was looking at the Indic origins, or say the Indic culture native to Trinidad, or have been brought to Trinidad by the British, I think, which might be a part of your own cultural history. And so she was going to her dad, who I knew as a famous asshole, and just like a really didn't like me at all.
For good reason.
And wanted to talk to her dad about this Indian origin, because she was really interested in her own Indian origins. And like, well, we're Black, but do you know about any kind of, Indian part of us? She asked. And he looked at her and like, Tamara, I'm not Black. Like, and like her head kind of, she had never asked her father that. And her father did not think of himself as Black, because there were people who were very Black in Trinidad. That wasn't him. He was, say, cappuccino, for lack of a better word. And so there was this kind of really kind of interesting, and I'm not, this is so far away from the conversation that we were talking about, but I don't know if it's terribly relevant or not, and we should cut it out. But I'm just wondering if you had a kind of response to that.
I'm not sure what you're asking, though. I mean,
so identity. What's your response?
Yeah.
What's the question?
Yeah, the question is, does it resonate with you about how context can shape our own identity, about how maybe the greater culture perceives us, which may be different from the way we perceive ourselves?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's all kinds of stories within ethnic studies, which was kind of a field that I dabbled in for some of my research projects. There's all kinds of stories of people who didn't realize they were Italian because they thought they were from this village in this region, and then they got to North America, and the people at Ellis Island or wherever said, "Well, you're Italian," and they thought, "Okay." And I think there are folks from India too, of course, who have they have the identification with their caste, with their village, with their region, with their language group, and then they're told by the space to which they move in Britain or the United States or wherever that they're Indian, and that's how they're going to be known first and foremost. So then people come to take on those identities, even though they, in their day-to-day lives in the little village outside of Goa, that's maybe not what they're thinking of when they wake up, that I'm an Indian citizen. They're thinking I'm a member of this family, this caste, this career, this village, which is near Goa, which is in this part of this state, and then they get framed in a different way when they move. That's very common. And in my own case, I tell the story of the Brahminical roots of my family, which some of my cousins didn't know anything about. I did a research project on people of Indian background who ended up in Canada, and some of whom became Christian at some point, either in Canada or in the West Indies. And a lot of the folks I talked to just had no idea of how Indians even got to the West Indies. So they didn't have this kind of colonial history that I grew up with, that they didn't grow up with. Because when their parents moved to Britain or the US or Canada, they had to change their story about what they were, right? Whereas in Canada, my father was framed as Black, even though he was Indo-Trinidadian, but he has kind of fuzzy hair and extremely dark skin. So in Winnipeg, there was no other way to read him. White folks just said, this is a Black man.
Yeah.
And so I grew up with a strange sort of identity, because I'm neither white nor brown, and fitting into neither space really comfortably.
And that's really kind of what I was trying to get to, is trying to talk about your own identity, and wondering, how within your own family, I was curious if there was any kind of prejudgment around these notions about yoga infiltrating our daily life.
No, I mean, not really. I think yoga came into my life so late that it was so much on the periphery of my awareness until I was really in my 40s. Because in religious studies, you tend to determine if you're going to be doing Western traditions or Eastern traditions, ancient or modern, text or culture. And so I was a modern Western culture guy. And so yoga was kind of really on the periphery of my awareness until it really was in my life, but also in my city. And that's when I became interested in it. And also that's when I realized, oh, actually, being half Indian, I have an unusual kind of comfort with some of these concepts, some of this language, some of the smells. Things felt very familiar.
Right.
And so that just got me really curious about the ways we tell stories about who we are.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's really interesting too, because maybe some listeners might not pick up on this, but you said you're a modern Western culture guy, and when we think of that, we would think, I mean, this book, Yoga Lands, and your study of yoga in the West totally fits into that. And yes, it does, but also Western religion has nothing to do with yoga. And so it's like they might not really understand how far off actually, or how modern you have to get in order to get yoga to fit into a Western religious studies category.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's why I was saying, like, really, we're talking about something that's occurred in the last 40 years, 25 years really, but let's just say 40 years, that in some sense yoga has been metabolized in Western culture, right? So that's why you can do a whole TT and hardly ever do you have to really grapple with the Indic origins.
Right.
And so the sort of boundaries between East and West are being, let's just say, negotiated at all times. So they're kind of permeable. Yeah. So even though I was trained to be thinking and writing and reading and teaching about kind of Western phenomena in the Western context, all of a sudden yoga was there among, right? And yoga was being practiced by people who had no Indic origins, no idea of the Buddhist, Hindu, Tantric, Jain background of yoga. They were just there. And so my curiosity was really generated by how people make sense of that. And the through line for me actually wasn't these kind of more abstract political questions around appropriation and so forth. And it wasn't the questions around America versus Canada. The real through line was the suffering body. It was actually physical trauma, physical suffering that people kept coming back to. I initially kept trying to steer them back to Canada versus the United States, or healthcare, or feminism, or cultural appropriation. And, people could talk about all those things. And there are chapters in the book on all these issues. Yeah. But it was really the kind of the vulnerable, fragile, human, soft animal that we all are that people kept bringing back in the conversations. They would talk about addiction, or they would talk about a car accident, or they would talk about depression or obesity, or whatever kind of pain, or in my case arthritis, drove them to try to do something different than whatever they had been doing before, whether they were just using a biomedical model or Christianity or secular wellness techniques. And they said, I need something different. And then they tried yoga. So it's suffering that binds
really the suffering.
Yeah.
Something that Harmony and I like to do is a slideshow together on the context and origins of Ashtanga yoga in Western culture. And we start with the Rig Vedas and the Upanishads, and then talk about these kind of cross patterns of assimilation and appropriation. And really what the slideshow is about is what is the trigger that occurs in the mental field that the self says, oh, that's for me. I'm going to do that. And, was it George Harrison? Was it Madonna? Was it Swami Vivekananda? What was the trigger for someone and then suddenly a whole culture to say, like China, to say, oh yeah, Buddhism, that's for us. We're going to take that.
Yeah.
And we're going to use it. And it's always, it's just so fascinating what that choice becomes. And like, yes, suffering is so very physical, so very personal. And someone's told you like, oh, you're suffering, your knees are broken. There is this, but there's also other things.
Yeah.
But you chose that.
Yeah.
And so something about, Paul Bramadat said, oh yeah, this could work for me. And as you said, like there's sensations that were familiar to you and interest and it said, oh, I will go for that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I suppose in some ways you could say there are as many answers to that question or that observation as there are practitioners. I don't think it's quite, yeah. I don't want to relativize it quite that much. I would actually say there are a few answers. So the reason that it took off as it did in the 70s and 80s was particular type of physical culture that was happening in the United States around women's fitness, especially. So aerobics, especially.
Jane Fonda. Yeah.
Suzanne
we put
Summers,
that in the slideshow.
Yeah.
Raquel Welch, Suzanne Summers, Jane Fonda. There's huge craze of aerobics, and then yoga got lodged in those spaces.
Yeah.
And then, with sort of macho culture being gym culture for men, and sort of competitive high impact sports culture for men, it took men out of those aerobic spaces, which were kind of framed as then being for women. And then I think you also have the decay or the decline of a particular kind of culture that takes care of itself, or takes care of its weakest members. So the rise of what we would call a neoliberal approach to governmentality. But that's a fancy academic word for the government getting itself out of your life, right? So Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Brian Mulroney, those three together, their effort was to sort of withdraw, to take the government out of the lives of everyday people. And that meant reducing the kind of safety net that people had to look underneath themselves for. And so that made the people much more reliant on their own wherewithal to deal with everything, social welfare or their health, for example. And yoga kind of becomes popular partially as a response. First, there's the question of women's autonomy and fitness. Then there's a question of, well, hey, look, it looks like we're kind of on our own here. The government is not providing universal or really effective healthcare. And here's this kind of wellness culture that emerges to kind of respond to the government withdrawing its funding and support for for a broader healthy society. And that happens, in the, let's say, late 70s, early 80s too. So, Thatcher, Reagan, Mulroney, etc. And then that becomes really that kind of becomes baked into North American societies, this kind of neoliberal tilt, the kind of removing of the government from your kind of, your health life. And I think yoga in some sense fills that gap for people.
That's fantastic, because I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I'm so ignorant that I when you said neoliberal, that sounded like a good thing.
Yeah.
And I was, oh yeah, liberals are nice.
Yeah.
But you really meant something completely different that I completely disagreed with.
Yeah.
But one thing that I've always kind of thought about yoga is that, especially when you get into the 70s and 80s and the kind of ideology of the Aquarian experiment kind of dying on the vine, you get a sensibility of punk ethos that is handmade, self-made, in your garage.
Totally.
We're going to have to just do this by ourselves, which is the result of Thatcher. You're going to have punk in England as a result, because you are left on your own. And people are going to be living in squats and going vegan because they can't afford meat. And so that I've thought about yoga arising as a punk movement, especially in Ashtanga yoga with the amount of tattoos that you see there, it's a punk culture. But thinking of it as a kind of response to a neoliberal movement casting out its society on its own, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good observation. So that the punk quality, and so you definitely do see that in Ashtanga, especially the New York scene, the Eddie Stern and company. You see that strong punk orientation. But what about, how would you then explain the kind of middle class suburban mums doing yoga? That's not really a punk movement. That's a kind of a mutual support culture.
But that is gentrification. And so when you go to a neighborhood that punks have made cool, and they've got a coffee shop and a bike store and now some interesting record stores. Now the property prices rise, which was previously a burned out ghetto, and people are like, oh, this is a cool place to live, and all the gays move there with their money, and suddenly, very quickly after the gays,
and suburban housewives,
you get middle class suburban housewives. Following that thread, and that thread is
doctor husbands.
That thread is continuous. It's going in a different direction we can't even think of right now. Like where are the gays moving to? That's the new thing.
But I mean, like those cohorts that kind of do it, your sort of DIY activist punk cohort, and then the middle class mom cohort. These are different cohorts, but they're both for some reason getting something from what is essentially in some ways the same practice of a physical practice with Indic origins, pairing breath and movement. And it's worthwhile to say, okay, so this looks like a similar practice. These two very different cohorts, which actually wouldn't be at the same potluck, right? The sort of New York punks, those folks, and the suburban housewife, they're not going to be the same thing, same potlucks. They might not vote for the same political party, but they still find some kind of common solace and some kind of strengthening and upbuilding in this experience. And that's kind of what made me curious about yoga as a North American phenomenon.
I think that it comes back to what you discovered was the underlying sort of unity of the theme of what was drawing people to the practice, which was suffering. Right. And that actually links it right back to the very origins of yoga and Buddhism, which is life is suffering. There's a way out of suffering.
Absolutely.
This is how we do it. We discover who we are and why we're here. Through these practices, these somatic practices, these philosophical disciplines, and studying reality.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, Harmony. Because when I get into conversations with people who want to cast aspersions on the white woman yoga practitioner, the kind of stereotypical white, no offense to your people.
Or to me.
She speaks for them.
She speaks for them. Yeah, some of my best friends are white women.
That's nice.
But a lot of my more activist, but let's say punk rock friends who are very critical of the kind of commodification of yoga, when they say to me, "Well, Paul, these white, bendy, beautiful women,
these people,"
and they kind of write them off, and I say, "Well, just hang on a second." And partly from being in the field, talking with so many of you, and hearing story after story of suffering. So it might not look like it from the outside, and I think that's one of the problems with having a conventionally beautiful frame, and as Russ said earlier, kind of glowing. That it's difficult for other folks to see the suffering in your story. But if you're an ethnographer and you've done an 1.5 hour long interview, that person's going to tell you about their addiction or their abusive husband, or their depression. Or their fear of, or their cancer diagnosis. That's not poverty. That's not they may not be a racialized woman, but they have they're carrying their own suffering. And I think being attuned to that everybody who walks into your yoga space, or who wants to have a conversation about yoga, regardless of how they look, is probably carrying some kind of suffering, because that was the unmistakable through line, which is why it became kind of the dominant vibe of the book, is how all of these practices and all these communities are kind of different ways of dealing with this kind of universal human experience. And we all deal with it in these creative ways. And every yoga lineage, or every yoga brand or denomination has its own kind of style of dealing with that suffering. But that's the fundamental dilemma they're dealing with.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the universal for sure. Powerful.
I guess for me, I'm.
Sorry. Okay.
I guess for me, I'm following you guys, and it's interesting, but I'm really just interested in what the gays are into next, whether it's yoga or not. Where are they moving to, and is it Frisbee, horticulture, cooking? I want to find out what we should be looking at.
Creatine.
Creatine.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, okay, who was your favorite? What was your favorite studio?
You can't do that.
Well, I practiced with Eddie Stern in New York, and that was pretty incredible.
Yeah. You're going to get the full psychedelic indic experience there.
Yeah, that was quite a beautiful experience. You know, and I a couple of the hot studio experiences. I don't really love hot yoga. I mean, I really don't love hot yoga, but it was really important to put myself in those spaces to sort of see what is it about this that appeals to people, and you know, how does that kind of suffering, how might that kind of suffering be yoked, you know, be somehow used by people to help them manage anxiety or whatever it might be. So those were useful. Yeah, I had so many great experiences. I mean, some of the experiences I've had here too, you know, this is kind of my home practice space in Victoria, have been quite profound. I also practiced in the sheep meadow in Manhattan, in Central Park.
Okay.
That was pretty cool.
Wow.
I practiced in an art gallery in Los Angeles, in a school. The art gallery was just down the road from the self-realization
Oh, cool.
fellowship.
Yeah.
And
That's a beautiful place in LA.
Yeah, I practiced in the basement of an art gallery right near Skid Row in Los Angeles, which was a really beautiful space. That was a 3-hour long practice. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, she was.
Was it a vinyasa class?
It was Ashtanga, but she was combining some things from second and third series. At that point, I was really still just in primary, so it was very intense, but beautiful, really quite beautiful.
Can I ask you? So I know we can't take up too much of your time. You've written a beautiful book, Yoga Lands, which is what we're talking about today, In Search of Practice on the Mat and in the World. And I think that there's a nonprofit. It's called Off the Mat and Into the World.
That's Sean Corn.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. And I don't know if I'm sorry to bring that up. It's a competitor to your book.
No,
but I'm wondering where
it's not a book. It's a nonprofit. Yeah, it's a movement.
I'm just wondering now, after publication, where do you find your research going now? Is there a direction that you're going to? Do you see yourself making a new book in the next year or two? Where are you going now?
Well, something that I mention in the final part of the book, I talk about the Me Too scandals, plural, that obviously cut like a scythe, like a an axe through so many yoga communities.
It's a before and after, and for our history. Yeah,
and certainly in Ashtanga, but also almost everywhere else. So I got very interested in that phenomenon, and I think yoga spaces, yoga communities got pretty good after that. That was a wake-up call for lots of them. They got pretty good consent cards. They expelled or excommunicated or otherwise peripheralized some of the problem teachers. And so I'm good with that. What I don't think the yoga community is as good at, and I might go in this direction, is what I call in the book the erotics of proximity, which is, I'm sure both of you...
I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
I'm sure both of you know this.
Can you define it?
Yeah. When a yoga teacher does an adjustment on your back and takes her boobs and plants them on your back, that's the erotics of proximity.
No. I mean, it's also not that. Here's what I mean. I mean, human beings, when they're vulnerable and they're open and they're curious and they're among other human beings, and they're doing things with their bodies, they're sometimes having contact with one another. I think to simply say, in a TT, for example, to simply say to the students in the teacher training program, don't do that. What you just described, Russ. Don't do that, or don't develop relationships with your students outside of class. Or, I mean, I think you can see the logic of that, right? That sort of essentially laying down a law. That's useful. But I think actually it would be useful for the yoga communities, plural, to have a kind of a common language about what it means, what it feels like to be among other suffering soft animals, and the strange complex energies that flow between people in that process, in the process of a person seeking healing, in a context of a person experiencing suffering and vulnerability and sometimes spiritual transcendence. And that can be weaponized or manipulated in terrible, dark ways, which we know from the Me Too movement. But it's just a fact of life that people are together on the mat in these studios, exchanging, I hate to use this term, but energies that are ambiguous. They're just ambiguous energies. And wouldn't it be good is if instead of simply saying, don't do that, we said to people, let's actually develop a more sophisticated language for how to think about these exchanges of energies that are occurring anyway. They are occurring anyway. Even if you say to yourself, don't touch her like that, don't look at her like this, don't touch him like that, be careful about this, look at how you're dressing. So you can have these kinds of rules and principles in your head. That's totally cool. We should all do that. But the reality is the energies are flowing anyway. So but they're flowing in a way that we're not allowed to talk about them. In fact, it's considered, you really shouldn't be talking about them. And wouldn't it be better if we could somehow talk about them in a non-creepy, non-invasive, non-threatening, safe way, which is honest about the adult erotics of proximity? So that, if I feel very brave, I'll maybe write that book or maybe a couple articles. But as a cisgender, heteronormative, I'm not sure what you call me, but as a guy who's straight but not narrow, let's say, I think maybe I'm not the one who should be leading that conversation, or maybe I should. I don't know, but I think,
or like Justin, like Louis Theroux, maybe you're the perfect person to ask those questions.
So I've got a variety of other academic projects on the go. But this is, probably my next book would be on this topic around the erotics of proximity.
I mean, I think the interesting thing, and I feel that this is a deficiency in a lot of the yoga trainings, and yoga in the West in general, that was very much, I think, in the tradition of yoga, slightly different. I mean, we've kind of sanitized the yoga in the West. And so it's all about anatomy and it's all about the physical body. And in India, they don't really see yoga that way. It's not about your physical body. It's all about your energy body. It's all about the movement of energy in your body. And your body and your mind are the same thing. And you have the energetic field and, the energy. The whole point of yoga is to understand your energy field, is to understand your energy, is to understand the energetic body and the movement of subtle energy through your body and in your body, and how that then influences or affects other bodies.
Yeah. And so your erotic body, or the erotic element of that, is one element of it. And can we have an adult, sophisticated conversation about that? I mean, we often do, but we turn to Tantra for that language. And that's fine, but it has the tendency to be very mystical and kind of occult, right? And it needn't be that way. So we needn't say, well, the people in the yoga world who are going to be able to handle this conversation are people who are really interested in tantric practices. We need to have ordinary folks in that strip mall in Idaho be able to have a more sophisticated conversation about this weird exchange of energies that occurs.
The sexualization of the word tantra is deeply unfortunate, because because if you're using the body to experience sensation to then cause transformation in your attitude, that's tantra by definition, which is what every single one of us is doing in every yoga room in North America.
Yeah, and so actually I have some colleagues, one of whom did a lovely blurb for the book, and she works on sort of what's happened to tantra in the West and the ways in which it gets kind of shrunken down in a way, and but nonetheless it means that it reflects the fact that we need some kind of language for thinking about that particular erotic quality to our subtle bodies or to our energy bodies, and I think that in a North American society that's so hypersexualized, the reality is that in a yoga space, those energies are simply going to be present because they're present everywhere else in the culture. Why wouldn't we think they'd be present in a yoga studio? Yeah. But can we develop the language among ourselves that would allow us to confront, not to negate, not to deny, not to suppress, but to acknowledge that it's there, and then think about responsible ways of being together in such a way that those energies don't come out in weird, problematic, damaging, self-aggrandizing, violent or horrible ways. Right? Surely simply saying, don't, be quiet. I mean, okay. It's not going to change reality.
That's that Protestant suppression all over again without actually having the conversation.
You're totally right.
I just looked up the word just to see what it meant. And eroica, did you actually say the word eroica?
No.
Or you just say erotic?
Erotics.
Well, eroica is an Italian term or Greek term that means hero. Mm-hmm. Heroism. Like that might be useful.
Yeah. No, you're right. I'm referring to eros.
Yeah.
Well, this was such a fun conversation. We
great.
could talk forever about this. I really enjoyed the book. There's so many wonderful points and stories, and it's a really fun read. Yeah. So thanks, you
Harmony.
for.
It's so good to see you again.
Yeah.
I can't wait to come to one of your workshops when our schedules can work together.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
A matter of fact, you're going to be in Scotland in just a couple of weeks. We can plug that, sweetie.
Very far from Victoria.
Oh. Nice.
Well, good to see you too.
But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. Dr. Bramadat, yes. Thank you. Sorry.
If you're ready to feel more aligned internally and in your life, I'd invite you to come into the Finding Harmony community. I've created it for exactly that purpose. This is an online space where spiritual practice meets real-life consistency, where we don't just talk about transformation, we live it. Together, we breathe, move, and reflect on the rhythm of nature's cycles. With new moon and full moon meditations, there's replays so that you can catch up on your own time with your own pace. We also anchor into practices like pranayama, meditation, spinal energetics that help you not only feel better and stay more focused, clear, and connected to what matters, but truly start to regulate your nervous system so you can step into your most expansive and abundant life. We do this all in community because accountability, support, and shared intention makes a difference. It's the difference between wishing and becoming, and healing happens in community. So if you want to stay grounded, grow in your practice, and start to bring your vision to life, this is your space. Come and join us inside the Finding Harmony community. You'll find the links in the show notes, and I would love to connect with you this summer. That's it. We've concluded another episode of the Finding Harmony podcast. I just want to thank you so much for doing the work that changes the world, starting with yourself. It truly does make a huge difference. Please make sure you have your automatic downloads turned on wherever you listen so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. I have so much more magic I can't wait to share with you. Lastly, if you're on Instagram, I love connecting and hearing from you. So come on over and say hello at Finding Harmony Podcast. And you can also come say hello to me personally at Harmony Slater Official. Thank you again for being here. I cannot wait to share more with you in our next episode.